The lecture on legal history has been going on now for quite a long time, and it's one that we always enjoy hearing from people who are giving historical lectures that somehow tie to themes that are contemporary. And I think you'll agree that John Witt's talk today is going to meet that standard. John Fabian Witt is the Allen H. Duffy Class of 1960 Professor of Law at the Yale Law School, the author of Lincoln's Code, The Laws of War in American History, which won the Bancroft Prize, a very prestigious award. And his talk today is called Weapons of Truth: Money, Propaganda, and Civil Liberties in World War I America. Join me in welcoming John Witt. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Tom, for that really generous introduction. I'm grateful to Alison Croy and Laura Weinrib and Nick Helmholtz and the Fulton Committee for inviting me, and to Aaron Wellen for generously and gracefully putting this together. I don't know if I see Aaron, but thank you to all of you. It's a special pleasure to talk about this subject, civil liberties in and around World War I, here at this law school. So this is the home of Ernst Freund, who wrote about these things in real time. I get the benefit of a century. He had to figure it out on the fly. The home of Harry Calvin, who set a high bar for all First Amendment and free speech scholarship. And as you'll see, my work is engaged with any number of Chicago scholars in the here and now, some of them in this room, and some of them outside in the greater University of Chicago. And so I'm especially interested to talk here for all these reasons. And in addition, because this is a project that's really just getting underway for me. I'm just at the beginning, so I'm especially anxious to hear your reactions and to get feedback. This is one of those projects where I think it's actually true that you can change this project. We can save it from whatever failings we identify along the way. So I'm looking forward to your reactions. I want to start in November of 1920. Warren Harding having just swept into the White House on a promise to restore normalcy. And shortly thereafter, just 3 weeks after, a restless Harvard dropout named Charles Garland did something that wasn't normal at all. He received a bequest of a fortune that would have been the envy of even the wealthiest of Americans, but he said no. He refused his inheritance. Vast unearned wealth, he said, and with some justification, was unfair, and he shouldn't have it. Well, this caused something of a to-do. The executors of the estate had never heard of such a thing. No one could recall an event like this in the recent past. Reporters from up and down the East Coast, from as far away as San Francisco, came to the Garland farm, a fashionable farm on Cape Cod, to talk to this young man. He was a handsome young man with a beautiful socialite wife, which made the story all the more alluring and appealing. And those reactions veered between the voyeuristic on the one hand and the scandalized on the other. The idea was the Russian Revolution was here repeating itself already as farce in fashionable Cape Cod. But a few well-placed people had different ideas. From Los Angeles, the writer Upton Sinclair, author of The Jungle, set right here in Chicago's meatpacking plants, proposed to Garland by letter that he give away the money rather than refuse it. And Roger Baldwin, who just founded the fledgling American Civil Liberties Union, met with Garland at the young man's family farm on the Cape, now made over as a fashionable experimental cooperative agricultural commune with a free love dimension to boot, and persuaded Garland to give the money to him and to Sinclair. And by 1922, a plan was in place. Garland would use the money to create a foundation called the American Fund for Public Service, later known as the Garland Fund, or alternately as the American Fund. The money, which was about $1 million to start, and which in the 1920 stock market became $2 million, or about $25 or so million in today's terms, was used for any number of interesting projects. So for the next decade, Baldwin and a small cast of characters that he gathered around the foundation that he and Garland had created pulled together a cast of characters to run the foundation. The fund's board included James Weldon Johnson, whom some of you will know as a polymath black writer and a songwriter and the head of the NAACP through most of the 1920s. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a fiery labor organizer who was a wobbly, a member of the Industrial Workers of the World. And any number of other figures on the liberal left, prominent figures on the liberal left in the 1920s, including Chicago's Robert Morse Lovett, who's a fascinating character, was an English professor here for many, many years, and a fascinating character in his own right, worth a project in and of himself. And meanwhile, Felix Frankfurter, on the Harvard Law faculty at this point, is bouncing around the edges as a kind of outside counsel and go-to person for any number of important projects that the Garland Fund took on. The fund's directors gave money to a host of causes: workers' education, strike communications, book publications, and a labor-friendly news syndication service. They financed the Scopes Monkey trial, the defense of Ossian Sweet and Sweet's family after a racially charged killing in Detroit, the defense of the anarchists Sacco and Vanzetti, whose appeals from their death sentences in Massachusetts was a liberal cause célèbre throughout the decade. They financed the ACLU. The critics on the right began to describe them as the hub of a shadowy conspiracy of the American left. And then in 1929, the fund began its final big push with a large grant to the NAACP. And when Brown against the Board of Education was decided in 1954, it was the culmination of the efforts the fund had begun in 1929 to create a blueprint and a plan, and then put that plan into action to pursue desegregation in schools in the South. Now their aim, Baldwin said, and they disagreed, the fund's directors, on almost everything. This was a fractious group of people who oftentimes disagreed with one another, oftentimes fiercely. But their aim, their collective aim, Baldwin said, and it wasn't a bad characterization, was, and I quote now, to free people's minds from the bonds of old institutions. And I'm tempted to say that they had some remarkable successes in that project. As much as anyone in the early and middle parts of the 20th century, the men and women of the Garland Fund took central roles in the movements that created values we hold dear today. Since the late 1930s, Americans have organized and reorganized our constitutional commitments around civil rights and civil liberties. In 1900, a successful political coalition wouldn't have had to pay lip service to these values of race equality and free speech. The opposite was true, in fact, for many political coalitions. But a century later, they do. At least for now, they do. These are central totems of our political life, our political world. And the language of civil rights and civil liberties is now pervasive across the political spectrum, notwithstanding lots of sharp disagreement about the content of those basic ideas. Now, how these deep transformations came to pass is, I think, one of the great constitutional questions of American history. Just as pressing as the decisions of the framers and the founding generation, perhaps more so, I say with Alison LaCroix in the first row, since after all, these basic values of our constitutional culture today, the freedom of speech and civil rights, don't take hold until the middle of the 20th century, a century and a half after the beginning of the Republic, and a century and a half into the life of the Republic. Now, what moved the men and the women on this fund was, I'd like to suggest, what I think of as the discovery of ideology in and around World War I. So a century ago, the problem of mass opinion ricocheted around the United States and Europe, really around the Atlantic world, among figures on both the right and the left. In the US, debate over public opinion stirred arguments over the very possibility of democratic self-government, and it led people like Baldwin, but not only Baldwin, to develop a new aim of their own: ideological disruption, the self-conscious destabilizing of systems of thought. It was their intuition that money would help them do this. Now, I have an ambitious plan, maybe too ambitious, for the next half hour or so. I want to tell a story, but I also want to make I also want to persuade you of two interwoven ideas. The first is that the problem of money and speech, the problem of speech as power, has been with us from the very start of the modern free speech and civil liberties traditions. And second, that grappling with this problem helped give shape to the transformations that I've described in modern American constitutional history. I'd like you also to come away with a sense that I have very strongly, which is that both the story and its implications resonate, as Dean Ginsburg suggested at the outset, with some of our problems today. Now, there's no better way to see this constellation of projects, I think, than to start with Roger Nash Baldwin. So Baldwin was an American patrician. Born in 1884, he likes to say that the family had come over on the inescapable Mayflower, and that describes, I think, something about his family, although it seems pretty clear that no one in his family was on the Mayflower, but the point remained the same. And as an intellectual matter, Baldwin's chief influence was 19th century Unitarianism, then the unorthodox but fashionable religion of the New England free-thinking elite. Antebellum Boston minister William Ellery Channing was still the towering figure by the latter part of the 19th century as Baldwin is coming of age. Channing taught that every person is endowed with a moral faculty, and Channing had himself a crisis of conscience in the antebellum years as he struggled to figure out how he could reconcile a Lockean epistemology on the one hand with his deep-felt anti-slavery views on the other, and in his sense, the common sense moral faculty of the Scottish Enlightenment supplied an answer for him. And it's the answer that underwrote both his opposition to slavery and also his particular version of liberal Christianity. And after graduating from Harvard College in 1905, Baldwin brought Channing's optimistic psychology into progressive reform. He headed for St. Louis and threw himself into the city's settlement houses, social work, and juvenile justice. Baldwin aimed there to relieve the bad environmental influences that he thought prevented Channing's moral faculty from expressing itself among the working and poor of the city. St. Louis, however, came to challenge these ideas, and so Baldwin, like so many of his progressive peers, promoted a set of devices that were designed to circumvent party politics and the machine party control of urban places like St. Louis. He had promoted devices like the voter initiative and the voter referendum that would allow the people themselves to govern, getting around the state, the formal institutions of the state, which repressed this moral faculty within. The aggregate moral faculties of the people would be able to express themselves despite the inhibiting structures of the state. But in St. Louis, a startling thing happened. The very first initiative put before the voters after Baldwin's successful amendments to the city charter was not one of Baldwin's progressive reforms at all. It was instead mandatory residential segregation, an initiative put forward by white residents. And despite fierce opposition in St. Louis's black community and fierce opposition by Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper, founded in St. Louis, and by Baldwin and some of his progressive allies, the people of St. Louis enacted this initiative by landslide. Now, Channing had turned to the moral faculty as a way to understand abolition and to criticize slavery, and now Baldwin saw the moral faculty of the people being expressed in the form of Jim Crow. Now, as it happens, this ordinance never went into effect. The St. Louis law was enjoined pending the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in a case challenging Louisville's similar law. These laws were sweeping the country at this point. And when the U.S. Supreme Court decided the case of Buchanan against Worley in November of 1917, the federal court in St. Louis struck the St. Louis initiative too. For the St. Louis area, though, it was too little, too late in some ways. Tensions had grown between black newcomers and white residents, especially white workers, who hoped to use the booming demand of the war and the reduction of the labor force during the war as a chance to organize and demand higher wages. And these tensions burst to the surface in East St. Louis, infamously, in July 1917, where one of the worst race riots in American history took place. And terrible atrocities ensued. Reporters observed African Americans shot down by mobs as they fled their homes, lynchings and the killings of small children. When all was said and done, the white mob had killed between 100 and 200 black men, women, and children. Now, the double blows of the Jim Crow Initiative and the East St. Louis race riot posed a deep challenge to the optimistic psychology that Baldwin had brought to St. Louis for about a decade, from 1906, 1907, right up to the beginning of World War I. And the war would only make things worse. In legal scholarship, the focus on World War I is typically, and I think understandably, on wartime speech repression. This is understandable because the beginnings of the modern free speech tradition come from judicial opinions arising out of the 1917 Espionage Act and its 1918 amendments, known as the Sedition Act. Most prominent among these opinions are District Judge Leonard Hand's 1917 decision in the Masses case in New York, and also then the dissents of Justices Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis beginning in the fall of 1919. And there was plenty of repression to dissent against. United States attorneys brought more than 2,000 Espionage Act prosecutions during and in the immediate wake of the war. Attorney General Thomas Gregory, the Jim Crow enthusiast from Texas, who spoke proudly of his male ancestors and their role in the Ku Klux Klan, urged on many of those prosecutions. Postmaster General Albert Burleson, an old friend of Gregory's from Austin, as it happened, was even more ferocious, famously denying the mailing privileges to 75 newspapers and some of the country's most distinguished magazines. In response to the twin campaigns of speech suppression from the Justice Department and from the Post Office, Baldwin, Roger Baldwin that is, and a cadre of his progressive allies invented the modern idea of civil liberties. They created an organization known as the National Civil Liberties Bureau, founded in 1917, which defended Espionage Act defendants, launched Publicity Act campaigns, on behalf of those who fell afoul of the Wilson administration, and lobbied for broad rights of conscientious objection in the wartime draft. Now, the group essentially coined, as Laura Weinrub's forthcoming important book describes, coins the term civil liberties, at least for American use. And shortly after the war's end, the wartime National Civil Liberties Bureau would become today's American Civil Liberties Union. But the Wilson administration had two strategies, not one. And I think this is an important point for us to focus on. Alongside repression came an outpouring of speech, a production of language, propaganda, many called it, a word that hadn't quite yet picked up its full negative connotations that we have today. And we do better, I think, to attend more carefully to this second piece of the Wilson administration's efforts for at least two reasons. First, the theory of the propaganda campaign, far more than we have understood, contained the key ingredients of the First Amendment free speech arguments that would be made by judges like Hand and Holmes. That is, the propaganda and its defense contained the ingredients of the ostensibly pragmatist First Amendment arguments. I'll try to explain this in a minute. Second, the propaganda problem, which is the problem of speech as a form of power, posed a new challenge to the civil liberties types like Baldwin, who were just getting started after all, as well as for figures like Hand and Holmes, one for which they had no ready answer, and one wonders whether we have any ready answers yet today. Now, George Creel has long been the central and controversial character in stories about wartime propaganda. In the spring of 1917, Woodrow Wilson appointed Creel to head a new agency, the Committee on Public Information, where he would coordinate the government's dissemination of wartime news. As a muckraking journalist whose mud bombs had splattered corporations, party machines, and progressive reformers alike, Creel had many enemies. Historians have not much liked Creel either, I think it's fair to say, since his propaganda campaign whipped up the frenzy of wartime intolerance and foreshadowed dangerous uses of propaganda by 20th century states in the decades to come. Creel aimed to instill what he called the war will, the will to win the war. And he did so in ways that verged on efforts at systematic mind control over millions of Americans. His committee published hundreds of thousands of pamphlets, placed advertisements in vast numbers, mobilized 75,000 speakers, the so-called 4 Minutemen, produced films, pageants, went to county and state fairs, and hosted exhibitions and the like. It was an unprecedented effort to alter what Creel called the mind of the world. Yet despite Creel's prominence in the literature, the scholars, I think, have understated Creel's significance for the First Amendment tradition occasioned by the war. So Professor Jeffrey Stone, in his now classic book on the subject, not old and yet classic, a good combination, sets Creel aside on the ground that government speech does not count as a constitutional problem. Now, stated this way, I have no objection. The institutional and prudential dimensions of constitutional law for courts may well mean that government speech is best left to the side. But in understanding the roots of the modern free speech tradition in constitutional law, Creel's campaign, I think, was actually crucial. And so here's the striking thing. From the spring of 1917 on, really even before, Creel is one of a number of key figures in and around the Wilson White House, vocally opposed to speech repression tactics. Even before the war began, Wilson administration insiders are urging the president to adopt a strategy of publicity as a superior substitute for tactics of censorship and repression. Influential journalist Arthur Bullard, for example, objected in 1916 to a censorship plan offered by a young War Department officer named Douglas MacArthur. Bullard reminded the White House that in modern warfare, powerful states needed to organize entire populations. Doubtless, he said, doubtless the devil could contrive some worse impediment to the mobilization of public opinion than a censorship of the press, Bullard observed cuttingly to Colonel Edward House, but I doubt if he ever did. In early 1917, as debate over wartime speech picked up, Creel himself publicly denounced proposals for censorship as criminally stupid. Censorship, Creel recommended to Wilson, is a word to be avoided. It was offensive, but worse than that, it was counterproductive. Worse than that, it was counterproductive. The amount of secret information, Creel said, was small compared to the vast amount of information that is right and necessary for the people to have. And so, Creel argued, there was no greater tragedy than the stupid rages led by governments to stifle discussion. Creel openly criticized any number of Espionage Act prosecutions. Privately, he called Attorney General Gregory a vicious old reactionary, and for the most part, during the war, he wasn't on speaking terms at all with Burleson. Creel insisted that his committee, and he was engaged in a lot of self-promotion himself, being a self-promoter as a professional matter, he insisted that his committee stood for the freest discussion that any people in the world ever had. Now, the important thing here is not to take Creel at his word, but it's to see that in the form of Creel and his influential allies in the White House, including Secretary of War Newton Baker, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, Colonel Edward House, even Wilson himself, the administration itself made pro-free speech arguments. Congressmen denounced the strongest versions of the draft spy bills in the spring of 1917 that later became the Espionage Act. Censorship, they argued, would allow corruption and incompetence to persist unexposed. The conservative New York Times even denounced suppression as not only wrong, but as much worse, self-defeating. Wilson joined in too on occasion. I can imagine no greater disservice to the country, he told critics of the Espionage Act, than to establish a system of censorship. Democracies, he continued, could not afford to lose the benefits of patriotic and intelligent criticism. Now, I don't mean here to minimize for a minute the Wilson administration's overreaching suppression of speech. Burleson and Gregory occupied positions in the politics of the White House that made it hard to restrain them. Wilson often didn't want to restrain them. Regional U.S. attorneys were caught up in war hysteria. Creel had an authoritarian streak alongside his ostensibly liberal one. But what should be clear is that throughout the war, people in powerful places gave voice to the idea that free speech was not a liability in wartime, but an asset. Speech was a weapon that democracies could deploy in war more favorably than authoritarian enemies on the other side of the Atlantic. Upton Sinclair put the point with characteristic flair. Writing to Wilson, he urged the president to rely on the weapons of truth rather than the crude tools of repression. Chicago's own Ernst Freund captured the same idea when he said in the spring of 1919 that the toleration of adverse opinion is not a matter of generosity, but of political prudence. Now, let this sink in. Support for open speech was not the argument of a slim minority of especially forward-thinking jurists and anti-war critics, or at least it wasn't only that. Powerful voices inside and outside the government argued in favor of open debate of the war, and many of them did so for the very particular purpose of promoting the effectiveness of the state in its war effort. Speech and the production of information were, in this view, forms of power, ways of doing things, ways of accomplishing ends that could be used by the state as an alternative to suppression, a superior alternative at that for the accomplishment of the state's wartime ends. Now, I think we may now be in a good position to say a few interesting things about the birth of the First Amendment tradition during World War I. For one thing, we can now see that the arguments about pragmatism and speech that animate so much of the literature in this area are misleading. Figures like Zachariah Chafee, Leonard Hand, and Oliver Wendell Holmes offered a standard pragmatic argument for speech rooted in the contingency and provisionality of our existing views about the world. If certainties are impossible, if fighting faiths will inevitably be overturned, we should be experimental about speech, when the pragmatist Truth, Chafee wrote, could be sifted out from falsehood only if vigorously and constantly cross-examined. Chafee's view, developed while teaching equity cases involving defamation at Harvard Law School, was that speech was in the balance, but that there were social interests on both sides of that balance. There was, of course, a puzzle. Why was the truth about Chafee's proposition about truth not itself subject to that same test? In the face of radical and pervasive uncertainty, what could offer pragmatist judges the certainty that their stance on speech was correct, especially when legislative majorities differed? Holmes had been a critic of those certainties for nearly a half-century by the fall of 1919, and it never dawned on him once, as far as we can tell, until the United States versus Abrams case in the fall, that pragmatism might warrant, perhaps even require, a free speech posture. Only months before, after all, he famously affirmed a whole sequence of Espionage Act convictions, including the conviction, most famously, of Eugene Debs. The question we should ask, I think, about the pragmatist supporters of speech in wartime is what counted for them as a relevant truth and why. Pragmatists said time and again that the test of a proposition's truth was whether it worked. But worked toward what end? Chafee, Hand, and Holmes were reluctant to specify a metric, but Creel did, Freund did too. The most common free speech arguments from 1917 to 1919, especially those that circulated widely inside the corridors of the government, were about enabling the state to accomplish its ends in the war. The loudest free speech arguments were about empowering the state to fight more effectively, not about constraining it or limiting its capacities. So conceived, speech was a tool of power, not a limit on it. And this wasn't the only problem either. Chafee, Hand, and Holmes seemed to imagine that the world of free speech would be one of an orderly testing of hypotheses and provisional ideas. Holmes said it would be like a world of free trade in ideas. Chafee compared free speech to a kind of courtroom cross-examination. Hand thought the right metaphor was the laboratory. But few in the middle of World War I's passions could have thought that speech took any of these forms. Baldwin recalled, for example, that his work was completely swamped by war fever. And what he meant was that there were no scientists standing outside the experiment. There were no market makers orchestrating a market as if from outside. And there were no lawyers drawing out courtroom testimony. The players in the wartime debates were all inside the maelstrom, not outside it. Wartime debates were shaping the minds of those who would be evaluating the tests of truth. Now, Creel's wartime campaign was not just, Creel's propaganda campaigns weren't just provisional hypotheses tested by the wits of independent listeners. They were self-conscious mobilizations of resources for the purpose of crafting identities, the identities of those listeners, identifying their friends and designating their enemies. They were self-consciously ideological projects. As the closest observers of Creel's work would say afterwards, Creel aimed and to a remarkable degree succeeded in literally choking the channels of communication with official approved news and opinion, leaving little freeway for rumor or disloyal reports. Journalist Frank Cobb, another important Wilson insider, thought the situation was an intellectual version of the struggles of the 30 Years' War in 17th century Europe. Bands of propagandists, and I love this particular image of the immediate post-war, this shattered landscape of immediate post-war intellectual life in America on Cobb's account. Bands of propagandists, Cobb wrote, wandered the country terrorizing public opinion, and the grave difficulty, as Cobb saw it, was that the more of the kind of publicity we have, the less we know. Now, Cobb's point is that because speech is purposive and socially situated, more of it is not always useful, at least not as a test of certain truths. Like good money in the face of bad, truths can be driven from the market. And sometimes, the more we have, the less we know. Now, here at a law school, I need to clear away some possible misconceptions. None of this is to say that judges ought to step in and try to, on their own, limit speech in the service of the right kind of political truths. The institutional and prudential obstacles to that kind of move may well be far, far too great. Even deciding whether courts ought to uphold democratically enacted campaign finance regulations would require more than I've told you today, since we want to know much more about the institutional positions of the legislature and the courts. But if, like Baldwin, one were interested in political mobilization, in the reordering of systems of ideas, and in the structure of discourse, then the wartime experience of speech and the reproduction of power is, I think, central and has to be central to our account. Now, we get a better sense of this, I think, if we drop down in the fall of 1919, not at the usual spot, not at the US Supreme Court, where important things are happening, to be sure, in the domain of free speech, but instead in Pittsburgh. It's a curious irony that the founder of the Civil Liberties Project, Baldwin, sat out much of the formative period of modern free speech. Baldwin went to prison in the fall of 1919 for nearly a year for refusal to participate in the draft. And on his release, he didn't go back into civil liberties work. He didn't go back into civil liberties work, at least not at first. Instead, he dove into the material understructure of American social life. He wanted to find the well springs of the kinds of propaganda, the kinds of expression and speech and language that had taken such powerful hold on the American mind during the war. Now, many in Baldwin's generation, as Professor Weinrib's forthcoming book illustrates so well, decided that those well springs lay in the relations between labor and capital. And so Baldwin went to Pittsburgh, then at the center of one of the most important labor strikes in American history, the Great Steel Strike of 1919. By the time Baldwin arrived at the strike, it had been going on for more than a month. As many as 250,000 workers had walked out in the first days of the strike. Production had been cut back, but a funny problem had soon arisen. It turned out that it was hard for labor to know what was going on inside the shop. By definition, the strikers were on the outside, and so labor had few or no first-hand reports of what was really going on inside the steel plants. They needed information. Strike leaders decided to send Baldwin into the giant Homestead Works, the site of the last great labor war in the steel industry nearly 3 decades earlier. Ostensibly, Baldwin would be a scab, but really, he would be an industrial spy sent to gather information on behalf of labor. But what Baldwin saw at Homestead was a stunning replay of precisely the pattern that he'd seen during the war. A potent mix of forceful repression and pervasive propaganda and information control. With a century's hindsight, the forceful suppression of the strikers by the state of Pennsylvania was nothing less than extraordinary. State police and local authorities ran roughshod in ways that are hard to imagine today. What was even more astounding, however, was the steel company's vast propaganda campaign. Newspapers, a subsequent church study concluded, did no first-hand independent investigation of the facts. Instead, they turned themselves essentially into relay devices for employer-side press releases, describing the strike as crumbling, the mills as running full, and the strike leaders as foreign radicals not to be trusted by good American workers. There was nary a word in the Pittsburgh papers about the goals of the strikers, nor about lawless conduct by the police, nor the capture of local governments by the United States Steel Corporation and other firms in the industry. It was, in a sense, George Creel all over again, choking the channels of communication. The strike soon famously collapsed. Baldwin didn't even get to see its end, notwithstanding its relatively quick demise after his arrival. Company officials decided that this implausibly well-spoken character was probably not a strikebreaker, probably not what he seemed. Company thugs soon paid a visit to Baldwin's rooms, and he wisely fled back to the American Federation of Labor. But Pittsburgh taught Baldwin some important lessons. The problem of speech by powerful actors, he learned, wasn't limited to the government. It wasn't limited to wartime. It wasn't just George Creel. Private actors, too, could wield speech as a weapon of truth. Propaganda, speech as a form of power meant to construct people's minds, was a pervasive fact of social life. Now, even more deeply, the war and the Great Steel Strike represented final nails in the coffin of Channing's moral faculty, at least for Baldwin. By the strike's end, Baldwin no longer believed there was any such thing. Instead, he agreed with Walter Lippmann. There wasn't even such a thing as public opinion in the sense of an aggregation of moral faculties. There were only phantom publics with opinions constructed in and around particular social formations. In 1919, Baldwin looked to class as the critical social formation, doing the work of constructing phantom publics. But we could add race, gender, political mobilizations too. The point was that we human beings are pervasively shaped deep into our core. The fighting faiths of one generation are indeed the target of the next. Now, the implications are daunting. They weren't missed by people like Lippmann, who thought about democracy in the 20s. But politics is subject to pervasive struggles not only over particular policies, but over its own subjects, For someone with Baldwin's orientation, there was an inspiration here too, a lesson about possibilities that were more hopeful. For if people are plastic, then we too can engage in the project of consciousness shaping. And that's what Baldwin set out to do in the 1920s. So to recap, to sort of bring us full circle before we plunge back into the American Fund, Baldwin entered a war clinging to a tattered remnant of an optimistic moral psychology from the 19th century. The war helped produce the beginnings of a free speech tradition and occasioned Baldwin's invention of the modern civil liberties tradition. But the war and its aftermath had also revealed troubling features about these new practices. Prominent versions of the free speech project were either dangerously naive about the conditions under which speech and debate took place, or they were a stalking horse for the state's wartime mobilization project. The pervasive role of language and expression in giving shape to who we are and the way we think meant that the use of speech as power and by those with power were already critical features of speech debates from the very beginning. The new First Amendment and civil liberties then were only halfway solutions that left central problems in the new politics of opinion formation unaddressed. Which brings us back at last to the American Fund, which you remember dimly from hours and hours ago at the outset. From virtually the moment of Baldwin's return to New York from Pittsburgh, he began seeking funds for experiments in how to change the minds of the country. Now, Charles Garland's gift essentially fell into their lap, kind of a manna from heaven, but Baldwin had been looking, along with a number of close allies, for something exactly like it. Garland's money meant that Baldwin could make an end run around the existing structure of politics without having to rely on a naive view of the capacity of civil society to produce the right outcomes. He wouldn't enter the lists unarmed, as he had in St. Louis in 1914 and 1915. He instead would go into the Coliseum armed with his own gladiator's tools. The American Fund aimed for projects, this is now their language, so new or experimental that they do not command general public support. And notwithstanding wide disagreements among the Foundation's board throughout the 20s, that key idea was constant with them. That is, they were looking for things that were outside the existing structures and outside the existing institutions. The fund used its resources to try to disrupt existing ways of thinking what Lippmann called stereotypes, or I think even better, Lippmann called lumps charged with emotion. Lumps charged with emotion. That's Lippmann's idea of the way stereotypes function in ordinary discourse. And to substitute new ones in their place. That is to say, the project was not to find experts, this would be the Lippmannian move, to find experts who could cut through those lumps and be messengers of fact, as Lippmann put it. The project instead was to surrender to the inevitability of lumps and just produce new and better ones. So its goal, I think, the fund's goal, is really something like what Professor Weinrib calls the right of agitation. Now, I'm only at the beginnings of telling the story of what follows, and hopefully you all will invite me back in a couple of years to give you the end. I can't give you a spoiler, I don't know the end. But what matters for now is two points. One that might help explain some of the roots of our contemporary constitutional ideals, and one that goes to the contemporary crisis, our crisis in those ideals. So first, with the help of hindsight, a number of historians have identified in Brown against the Board, the great icon of our civil rights law, a thin, formal strategy poorly suited for accomplishing the goals of substantive equality. Now, there's something to be said for this argument. Some of my best friends have said it, and we've learned a lot from this strand in the historical literature. But if we reorient ourselves to the position of the American Fund in the 1920s, I think the problem might appear quite differently. The goals of the Fund's directors included the very forms of substantive equality that Brown's critics, its sympathetic critics, admire. But what the Fund's leaders found from 1917 in East St. Louis to 1919 in Pittsburgh, and then in labor strife throughout the 1920s, was that organizing labor in the United States fell repeatedly into a trap. The presence of a reserve army of the unemployed in the American South. Mills facing organizing drives would simply go south. African-American agricultural workers simply moved north, especially when strikes and wartime demand produced great opportunities for them. And so, after years in the 20s of failure in organizing with money using from the Fund's finances, the American Fund turned to the education of black children not as the abandonment of the strategy of substantive equality, but as its next logical step, as a way of promoting the same organizing strategy. In East St. Louis, the old psychology had foundered on the shoals of race, and now the new psychology, would aim to remake American race relations. Brown against the Board is thus, in its beginnings, an organizing case, just one for the long term rather than the short term. And by the end of the 1920s, a decade of failure after failure for the American labor movement, long-term thinking was the order of the day. Now, I think there's an important observation to be made here in the way in which civil liberties and civil rights were yoked to one another at the very outset of this great constitutional transformation. In many respects, they're opposed to one another during this process. And here's a deep way, I think, in which they were yoked together. And this brings us to a second and more troubling point. For it's an open question whether relying on money and the exercise of power in civil society, as the Garland Fund did, actually builds in limits to the kinds of ends that can be thereby achieved. Carnegie and Rockefeller and Rosenwald dwarfed Garland. Now, I don't mean to say that Baldwin made a mistake in seeking out funding for a private foundation. He had tried working through the state back in St. Louis. In the war and in Pittsburgh, he'd come to see and to know the limits of speech unaccompanied by power and resources. He seemed to have few other good choices. And we have today, as David Cole's new book reminds us, seen big transformations in constitutional law driven by civil society. But the Garland Fund strategy of power in civil society was easily co-opted for reasons that Baldwin had reason to understand and that Cole does not, to my mind, adequately confront. Civil society does not exist as a free market or a natural laboratory. It is shaped just as opinion was shaped in the war and as views were shaped in the Great Steel Strike. And when others have more resources, then turning to private power as a strategy to disrupt power turns out to be a dangerous game. Now, this, of course, is one reason the story of the fund is worth paying attention to now. We live in an era of politics, we live in an era of money and politics and speech. Citizens United has come to stand for an entire universe of problems about the ways in which expressive freedoms, which we understand rightly to be at the core of democratic self-government, can also be democracy defeated. And of course, we live in a world of the private foundation, Gates and Soros and Koch and Zuckerberg and so many others. Even more, we live in a new era, I think, of ideological instability. The generation of the American Fund invented some of the key ideals of our own time: free speech, civil liberties, race equality, civil rights. But today, many of the basic icons of the 20th century settlement, let's call it, civil liberties and a certain model of equality, seem implicated in the difficulties that we face. Civil rights projects become campaigns against affirmative action in which the Brown against Board idea turns into a defense of racial privilege. Markets and ideas give rise to new limits on the capacity to regulate powerful economic actors. Equal opportunity for intellectual expression becomes part of a meritocratic university system now implicated in the inequality crisis. Now, I don't have here any clear answers to any of these problems. I'm sorry, I'm disappointed at the end. I told you from the outset when I've left. But it does seem reasonably certain that these difficulties will require the kind of ideological disruption and transformation that Baldwin set about making in the 1920s. There is, however, something I think we can say here, and especially in a Fulton lecture, and that is, let's have a new history of American constitutionalism, not one besotted with the 1780s and the 1790s, but one that engages the 20th century charismatics, eccentrics, giants, and social mobilizations, and their distinctive projects. They, not the generation of Hamilton, which my children have seen twice, created the most salient features of the constitutional culture in which we live, with many of its virtues and its vices. Now, much of this is already underway in the work of folks here at Chicago and elsewhere around the country. One useful next chapter, I submit to you, will be the story, the unwritten, the unfinished story so far, of the American Fund for Public Service. So thank you very much. I would love to hear reactions and thoughts.
So John,
Excellent. Yes, please.
Yeah, John, I want to ask you about this pragmatist account of free speech. So you use the expression free speech is a weapon of truth a number of times. Now that's an idea in Mill. The thought is by encouraging free speech, that is a means to which you arrive at truth, where truth is understood as a correspondence between your beliefs and how things really are. But that's not the pragmatist understanding. As you said, truth and pragmatism is what works. What I want to ask you is what exactly that meant in the period that you're talking about. So one way to interpret it would be to say what works towards the achievement of some substantive end, such as preference satisfaction, maximizing utility, maximizing wealth. But I thought there was another strand in what you were saying, and that was, what is working is a matter of disrupting existing beliefs, that there is some kind of inherent virtue in constantly challenging beliefs that are entrenched. Not because the new belief is better in some sense, but the mere fact that it's challenging the existing belief is itself the improvement, not some sort of difference in the content. So, two questions. Which was the kind of view that was in play? Was it a substantive one, or was it mere this idea of valuing change in and of itself? And second, to what extent was this more than a kind of elite enterprise? Because the idea of truth as correspondence is deeply intuitive to most people.
So, great. I'll take them in order. So, I think we see a split in the story that I just told between two different groups. One, let's call them the statists for simplicity's sake. Many of them are not inside the state, many of them are journalists and like, for whom the project, there is a substantive end. They're substance guys. They want to win a war. And they think that if you don't have free speech of a variety of different kinds, well then terrible commanders are going to get away with, well, essentially actually with the murder of their own troops. They're going to screw up in some way and hide it, and the speech is the way to out them and that democracies can do this distinctively well. This is the democratic advantage. This is how you win wars. So that's a substantive project. And I think that idea of speech as a weapon could be deployed to any number of substantive ends. I mean, that is, the war happened to be the one that brings it to surface, but it's a supple weapon that can be used to any number of different kinds of ends. But there are, I think, let's call them process folks here, who, I mean, they're going to sound a little like John Dewey. That is to say, there's going to be there is a sense that they are not certain about their ends, but they think churn is the way to flourish. And they are not the folks associated with the state. They are some of the people in and around the fund, not all of them. There are, especially as you get into the latter part of the 20s, there are on the fund board, always at least one pretty hardcore member of the Communist Party who's not really interested in churn for its own sake, but has a substantive end, and thinks that the pursuit of the fund's strategies, which sometimes include free speech and sometimes don't, are ways to pursue that substantive end. But there is a lot of this process move going on. Well, I'm sorry. The second piece was elites and non-elites. Yes, mostly it's an elite story here. I mean, the folks I've talked to you about today are all highly educated intellectual types, social mobilization leaders. There are ways in which the literature of the left has ways to bring some of these ideas in remarkable sophistication, actually, to workers. I mean, think of the kinds of things that Ben Gitlow is handing around, or the literature underlying the Abrams case. So these literatures are actually engaging some of the problems we're talking about here. Jeff.
So at the very end, I was intrigued by the fact that you noted that there are, but I take it from your standpoint, there were good principles that have been corrupted. So the principle of free speech, which was meant to basically protect the rights of dissenters and outsiders and critics of the government, has turned around to basically now be used to protect the wealthy and corporations and largely the dominant forces in society from regulation by the majority. And you also made the point about racial equality, where the original principle was one that was designed to deal with protection of minorities who had been historically oppressed, and then that gets corrupted to turn it around to prevent laws that were designed to benefit those very groups. And there was a third example you gave.
Well, I think I even threw universities in there just for good measure, because I didn't want us to get
right.
scot-free.
Right. But so the question, though, and I take it from the way you framed that, is that you sort of like the principles that originally were conceptualized, but that in your view they have been corrupted. And the question is, why were they corrupted, and what do you do about that?
Great question. So I wouldn't put it quite that way. The claim that I wanted to make here was that they are our ideas. Not even so much that I like them. I mean, I like them as much as the next guy. They are the things that organize our politics. They are, of course, susceptible to multiple interpretation. And the question I want to ask is whether the mode of engaging these problems through civil society made them especially vulnerable. That is, here's the strategy: we're going to go private foundations, use civil society and private power. The state is not going to be the way in which we're going to engage in this process of disruption. Not for bad reasons. It wasn't just a bad strategy. There are good reasons. See St. Louis for driving this. But that process of pursuing that channel for pursuing these ends, which are admirable and but just are our ends, gives rise to a set of processes that make them vulnerable to all sorts of alteration. And so the question is something in the choice to use the fund participating in a process, a strategy that's especially vulnerable to that kind of a subversion. I hope is that something of clarification? Now, I haven't even begun to develop institutional fixes that could entrench the good version as against the bad version. But I don't know that I want to be in that game for this purpose. I want to identify the construction in this moment of ideological systems at a moment of disruption and reconstruction, recreation, and then observe the way in which those systems are breaking up in our own time. And I guess the last answer to this is, Baldwin's lesson would be that it is up to us to champion the particular versions that we would see turned into the next round of ideological systems. And that is the constant process of struggle. And it does seem to me that we're at one is always at risk of overestimating the importance of one's own moment. But it does seem to me that many of the problems we have today are symptoms of the difficulties internal to ideals that are set up in this period. That is, they're intrinsically connected in some important way, and that's what I meant to identify that.
I'm wondering about to what extent people had sort of discomfort about the private foundations leading this, and this is a sort of how much can we analogize to today or not? Because one could tell a story. I mean, it's interesting that the board of the disruptive foundation is, involves communists and artists and all the rest, who presumably are not really seen as selling out, and there isn't this concern that the wealthy can have control. Foundations are doing this work, and that's some sort of failing. The way that people might make as a critique today. So was it just they were so much rooted in their era that they thought actually this is the sort of happy progressive story, like the right thinking wealthy people are doing the right thing, or was there discomfort about that as a fit that's a little bit odd?
There's lots of discomfort. There's lots of discomfort. There are critiques of the much bigger projects going on, and it's not. I have family in Western Pennsylvania, which isn't the only reason we dropped down to Pittsburgh, I assure you. But there are plenty of towns in Western Pennsylvania that tried to or did successfully reject the Carnegie Library. They don't want Carnegie's money. They remember Homestead, right? So 1892. So there are lots of critiques of private foundations. Interestingly, they accelerate in and around the Walsh Committee that Laura Weinrib's book is organizes part of itself around. The Walsh Committee is taking testimony and hearings about industrial problems in the country, 1912 to 1915, and the Ludlow Massacre is a Rockefeller-connected labor problem which produces a terrible massacre in 1914. That then produces a whole engagement with the question of the Rockefeller money, which is already being used for large charitable and philanthropic enterprises and industrial strife. So there's a critique circulating at the time. George Creel actually takes a large role in criticizing the Rockefeller money, which he sees as tainting not just industrial relations, but tainting the progressive movement, because there's Rockefeller money in lots of the progressive reformers of the day, in particular a journal called The Survey. And so Creel has a big fight with Paul Kellogg, who's running The Survey in 1914, 1915. So there's and published an article called like the tainted journalism or tainted progressivism. So there's a big critique, and Baldwin is very much aware of that. He's in touch with the Rockefeller and Carnegie folks at the outset to get sort of best practices. He figures he should figure out how you're supposed to do this. But he's also really worried that its private accumulation of power is in some way illegitimate. And as a result, they decide they want to spend down the money as fast as they can. They don't want to have a perpetual life for this reason. And it's only because they make so much money in the 20th stock market that they don't successfully end themselves earlier than they do. Aziz.
So I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about the idea that you identify, I think, most of Creel in the first half of your talk, which is the notion that propaganda and free speech alike are instruments for state legitimation, the furtherance of both the creation and the maintenance of the state in the face of challenges from exterior, from outside and inside. In a sense, that seems a very old idea. In a sense that it might be the idea behind the Bill of Rights, right? Well, we, the anti-federalists, will give you a new constitution with all these big, robust new institutions. You've got to give us in exchange the right to free speech. So in some sense, it goes back there. But I wonder where, or I wonder whether you can say more about how, in the specific wartime context that you're discussing, that yoking together was conceptualized and intended as an argument. Is it matter merely of Creel being someone who comes from a journalistic tradition and therefore declines to see a conflict between propaganda and free speech, sees them as being yoked together? Are there people not just looking back in European history to the 30 Years' War, which you mentioned, but states that were in their time quite successful, but quite successful through the use of extensive censorship, the Bismarckian states and the like? Are there people, perhaps not in your cast of official actors, but in the larger academic circles, thinking of the accounts of state legitimation being developed in this time, but maybe not disseminated in the American context by people like Gavel? So the idea that the legitimation of the state isn't a function of violence, it's a function of charisma, which is a term that you end up picking up on at the end, toward the end of your talk, right? Where is this idea that, in other words, where is this idea that speech together, private speech, free speech, when concatenated with robust government speech, even propaganda, are alike instruments of maintaining and furthering the project of a powerful state?
So a great set of nested questions. One interesting feature of the story, which I didn't get into in my remarks, is that in 1617, so once you get to the fall of 16, as people are starting to think more seriously about the coming conflict, European censorship regimes are being discussed. So Woodrow Wilson actually spends a lot of time criticizing European censorship regimes because they're preventing mail and the like from coming to the United States, so there are unhappy constituents in the US about European censorship regimes. And Wilson is quite outspoken about the problems with those regimes. So there's already the development from 1915-16 onward of a sense that the United States does things differently, that its mechanisms of legitimation are rooted in a free speech tradition. As I talked today about the free speech tradition attached to the courts, which is, after all, a tradition that we spend the most time with in law schools, and it's an important subject. But there are, throughout the 19th century, lots of Americans who think of themselves as part of a country organized distinctively around freedom of inquiry and free speech. And so there are even lots of judges who say that. They just think they have a Blackstonian version of what that means. So that is to say, I think when you get to the war, the existence of these European contrast cases and the existence of a long tradition of thinking of America's distinctive, the United States' distinctive role as being a free speech place helps produce this particular combination, if that's useful. Thanks.
So this is really interesting because it's sort of a side of Baldwin that's in some sense a tension, I think, with what he's doing in his work through the ACLU. And so I was wondering if, or at least I guess I'd invite you to comment on whether you see it that way, because obviously, you present the Creel Committee and the Steel Strike as Saturday events, which in some sense they were, but of course he saw these things as he saw the state and capital as completely linked, right? And as you know, Baldwin was a pragmatist and was willing to sort of fall back on any method. So I guess the question is, in his other work, he's constantly trying to break down the concept of private property. He's attacking, he has just as much to say about civil liberty being asserted against private actors as he does about the state. Is this just why do we interpret this as his sort of affirmative project rather than just a fallback in a world in which he thinks that the decks are stacked against him, essentially, that basically a strong state which is essentially a mouthpiece for industry is promoting its vision and full force, and how is someone to counter that? And he has this money, he has a meager project, but could he ever really imagine, in 1920 that would be an adequate answer? And I guess sort of in a different question, but just sort of there's this quote from Attorney General Jackson in 1940, which has always been puzzling to me, which is about with the rise of advertising, he sees this as an antidote to totalitarianism, because it's going to inure Americans to all of the sort of centralized state propaganda of the kind they see in Nazi Germany. We'll learn basically that it's all garbage, and if there's an overflow of it, it will no longer be effective as a propaganda tool. And in some sense, I could imagine traces of that in Baldwin. So that's
Good. Okay. So super interesting thoughts on Baldwin. One of the things that I found appealing about pursuing the fund was that it produced a way to look at a certain strand of the American liberal left in the 20s and into the 30s that wasn't organized around the ACLU. It was doing different things. It produces a more eclectic set of engagements and allows you to see someone like Baldwin in a different light. He is, as you know better than I do, an ideologically eclectic person. As you were with pragmatist, and I'd embrace that. It's not like a capital P, right? So it's and he's self-consciously this way. He's an actor in the world rather than a thinker about it. And so one of the challenges for me in this project, and I may err on any number of things, but I really may err on this, is trying to reconstruct a full-blown theory for Baldwin where he's just doing stuff. I mean, he just wakes up and he goes. I mean, one of the things that I regret about writing here about the 1920s, having written about the 1860s last, is the telephone exists for him at the 20s. He's on the phone all the time. I mean, you just picture, this was like the greatest, he must have had 3 or 4. And he was like doing stuff, and he woke up and he's like picking up the phone and going. And you only get little hints of that creeping through into the paper. I'm glad the NSA is now collecting these things. Jeff and the NSA are collecting these things, so we won't have this problem in the future. So he's not a first principles thinker. He's just doing stuff. But I think it's hard to do stuff without a tacit, half-baked theory. You don't know which number to call. You have to have so the project here is to try to reconstruct a kind of lived political theory, and that lived political theory that I try to reconstruct here around Baldwin. It is one, as you know, it's about this ideological disruption story. That's the story that I've tried to tell. And I think that focusing on the fund's activities may help highlight the way in which the ACLU activities are just one piece of it. That is, and one could be misled if one follows too carefully the way in which they tack one way or another as they reach the 1930s equivalent of Nazis and Skokie. So Ford Motor Company, as you've written about, or other crises for a left-leaning civil liberties project. So I take it that, so there's some rambling answers. I hope we'll be able to carry on. Yeah.
This will be the last question.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to the philanthropic dimension. So in terms of thinking how the ideological systems get set up, I think one place to look would be state incorporation law. So I'm just curious about the charter of the fund, where it's incorporated and what its purpose is. I know in New York State, they're very hesitant to give charters for explicitly political speech because they don't want to get accusation that sponsors one from a political speech over another. The second place would be income tax exemption and how grant making and speech is conceived in relationship to still getting the income tax exemption. I think part of the story here is how 501c4, which is supposed to be about social welfare, ends up becoming this expansive category for people to engage in political speech. So I think here, I guess the question is how the kind of tax history lines up with the constitutional history that we're trying to get to.
Right. So this I spent some time with the organization, the legal organizational structure of the Garland Fund, and it's totally fascinating. They fight for a while to become a New York corporation, but are unable to. The Secretary of State of New York is not signing off on this. So they, like every other corporation, go to Delaware. Right? So they are a Delaware corporation, and they spend a good deal of time worried about tax consequences of their activities. And they have tax counsel that manages, after some wrangling with the federal government, to get the right tax status so that they are tax exempt on the income they earn as well as the liquidations that they're given. So they are navigating these structures, which, and one of the reasons I think I'll pursue this more with them, is that these structures are just being created. That is, they're just being put into place because we have an income tax, essentially for the first time. And these problems are being worked out in organizations like the Garland Fund, sort of for the first time. They're one of the first really politically pushing of the nonprofit foundations. Rockefeller and Carnegie being above that, not doing anything pushing, just being self-evidently philanthropic. So I think these are important questions. And once we get into the middle of the 20th century, the latter part of the 20th century, they're going to be huge public policy questions. And there are ways in which this is the beginnings of that. I hope that came across. One of the reasons that it's appealing to me is because there's that dimension. It's about the private foundation.
All right, I know there are more questions, but we will have an opportunity to continue the discussion with John. There's a reception to which you're all invited outside. But before concluding, join me in thanking him for just such a terrific area.